Good morning, folks. Welcome to another of our devotions. We're going to continue looking at Psalm number 9. Having looked at the first two verses in our last devotional, we're going to look at verses 3 to 8. Verses 3 to 6 highlight for us the wonderful deeds of which David speaks in verse 1. He's going to give thanks to the Lord for his wonderful deeds, and in these verses that we're looking at today, David details what those wonderful deeds are. He's thinking of a situation from which God had wonderfully rescued him in the past. He had given him victory over his enemies when he was being pursued by his enemies. In all likelihood, David here is thinking of the foreign nations against which he had fought early in his kingship in order to expand the borders of his kingdom. God had been with him, and God had caused David to get victory over his enemies. He puts it in poetic language here. He says, "My enemies turn back. They stumble and perish before your presence." David sees God not only being with him, but going out ahead of him as he fights against his enemies. And because God is with him, he overcomes his enemies. God is working in and through David's army to bring about God's purpose. And the result is the opposing army suffers great losses and they retreat. David gets victory over his enemies. The reason, of course, is because David is God's king, and as such, he is a righteous and just king. He is living and ruling for God and for God's glory. That being the case, God upholds David's just cause. We see that in verse 4. In verses 5 and 6, David speaks of the complete victory God had given to him. Let's read verses 5 and 6. "You have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out their name for ever and ever. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished." The reason God can do this, of course, is because God is sovereign. He's in complete control. He's working out his plan and his purpose. You see that in verse 7. "The Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice." Ultimately, truth and righteousness, that truth and righteousness that marks God's kingdom, will prevail over all God's enemies. God will overthrow them, and the godly will be preserved. So verse 8, "And he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness." So David has been reflecting on his victory over the enemies that came against him. Every victory in battle that is recorded in the Bible that God's people have over their enemies is a reminder of us and a pointing forward to the ultimate victory that Christ, the great King, will have over his and his people's enemies. No matter how powerful, no matter how numerous, no matter how influential, no matter how well equipped the enemy might be, they will be routed. They will, as David puts it in this psalm, stumble and perish before the God of perfect righteousness and justice. All God's enemies will come to an end in everlasting ruin. Why? Because the Lord sits enthroned. But we can think of this on a more personal level as well. And on a more personal level, we can take encouragement from these truths. They remind us of the God who is with us. He's with us in our individual battles that we have to fight with our enemies. And the greatest enemy, of course, is indwelling sin and the temptation that arises from that sin. With God's strength and with God's help, we get victory and rejoice. We get success over our enemies. In the battles that we have with sin in our lives, God is able to give us victory. And we fight knowing that not only will God help us in each individual battle, but that one day victory in the war with indwelling sin will ultimately be achieved. God will deliver us from the power of sin one day and the presence of sin. And that's why we can say with David, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. So in your battles today and in the days ahead, with the enemy of sin, indwelling sin, the enemy of temptation, remember, God is with you. God goes before you. God can give you victory. And in that glorious truth, find your hope and find your reason for praise. Have a great day. Every blessing.